Everybody knows that a Malaysian airliner disappeared into thin air on the evening of March 8th, 2014, with 239 people aboard, and that to this day, the mystery remains unsolved. What a lot of people don't realize is that the plane didn't just vanish once, it actually vanished 4 times. In today's episode of Deep Dive MH370, we're going to break down the first phase of the flight, from the totally normal taxi and takeoff, right up until that first vanishing. We're going to look at what happened and how those first few clues can already help us start to narrow down what might be the reason for the plane's disappearance. Hi, I'm Jeff Wise. Welcome to episode 2 of Deep Dive MH370, The First Vanishing. This is a remake of the original episode that I produced with Andy Tarnoff back in September of 2023. We were just starting the original season of the podcast. We were just learning the ropes, so the original version of the episode was audio only. I don't have access to that original YouTube page. Andy has gone his separate way. So I'm creating an updated and remastered version of each episode of the original season every week. Okay, let's get right into it, starting with a departure from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The flight was a run-of-the-mill red-eye flight from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia to Beijing, China. The plane was a 12-year-old Boeing 777 airplane with 239 people aboard, 227 passengers and 12 crew. The captain, 53-year-old Zahari Ahmad Shah, was one of the most experienced captains Malaysia Airlines had, with more than 18,000 hours of flight time. His first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid, was just getting started in his career. He had just 2,700 flight hours. The flight was scheduled to depart at 12:35 a.m. local time and actually took off from the runway at 12:42, so pretty much exactly on time. So far, everything was boringly normal. The plane took off to the northwest, then turned to the east. It had been cleared to fly directly to Igari, a waypoint at the very edge of the Kuala Lumpur air traffic control zone. Beyond that lay the Ho Chi Minh control zone that was operated by Vietnam. From there, it would pass over eastern China on its way to Beijing. On this night, the weather was good. There was very little other traffic around. It was ideal flying conditions. Really, no red flags, no reason to be concerned. 20 minutes into the flight, Zahari made a call that has attracted a fair bit of discussion. He called up ATC and he confirmed that they were flying at 35,000 feet. This was a totally unnecessary call. He did not need to make it. And some, especially a YouTuber called Mentor Pilot, have made a big deal out of it. He's spent a lot of his YouTube video on the subject, speculating on why he might have made the call, listening carefully to the intonation, asking if it was a little tense, if he seemed a little harried. Personally, I don't think we can really draw any conclusion. It's slightly abnormal, but pilots are not machines. They might make unnecessary calls sometimes. They might use sort of non-standard wording sometimes. It might mean something, it might not. We just don't have any evidence one way or the other. And so I find it really hard to make a big deal out of it because it doesn't point us in one direction or another. It's curious, but there's a lot of curious things about this case, things that are way more curious, actually. Okay. So at 1:19 a.m. local time, when the plane is about 100 kilometers beyond the coast of the Malay Peninsula that it had been flying over until that time, the captain has an exchange with the air traffic control. Basically, the air traffic controller gives him permission to leave the zone that he's currently in and contact the next air traffic controller, which is, as we've said, in Ho Chi Minh. And in response, this has all been settled now. The captain says, "Good night, Malaysia 370. This is the last transmission that the plane made. You have no doubt heard it many times. It is very standard in the context in which it occurred. As a plane flies from here to there, it's constantly leaving one area of jurisdiction and entering another and getting a handoff. Then it leaves that area to enter the next one after that. It's constantly saying goodbye to one area and saying hello to the next, only to repeat the process when it leaves that next area. So this is a very mundane thing that happens constantly all the time, very familiar routine. And it's so routine that, as I said, sometimes pilots use non-standard language. They might say, hey, thanks, or have a good night, something like that. Just a human interchange. The important thing is not to clutter up the frequency. Sometimes if it's very busy, people have to get their information across in a very concise way, and you really can't have people just using any phraseology that they want. They have to keep it tight. But at times like this, when it's the middle of the night, you can sort of be a little more loosey-goosey. This isn't particularly loosey-goosey, but he says, good night, Malaysia 370. A minute later, the plane reaches that navigational waypoint. And this is the waypoint that we mentioned earlier, Igari. It's marked on aeronautical charts with the code name IGARI. And let me just explain a little bit about what that is. All around the world, there are these navigational waypoints that are marked on charts. They have 5 letters, and they generally are pronounceable. They might be nonsense. They might have some local relevance. For instance, if you're flying near Disneyland in Anaheim and California, you might see waypoints with names like Disney, DSNEE, or Mickey, MCKYE, and, a little bit of fun, a little bit of, local flavor for the pilots, a little kind of bit of touch of humor, as it were. But a lot of times I don't know if Igari means something in one of the local languages of Southeast Asia, but it doesn't matter. For the purposes of navigation, it's just an easy to pronounce designator that the pilots are given instructions to fly to. And this particular one is the last waypoint in the Malaysian controlled airspace. So this marks the point at which the flight is entering a kind of transitional space. It has just said goodbye to Kuala Lumpur air traffic control. And for the time being, nobody is paying attention to it. Standard procedure is for the captain of the plane, or whoever is flying the plane, to then, they've got 3 minutes to kind of get their act together, make sure they have the right frequency to dial into the radio, to call up Ho Chi Minh in this case and say, we're with you at this certain flight level, and this is our flight designator. And then the air traffic controls at the other end will say, okay, great. And they'll keep an eye on them until they have to hand them over to the next air traffic controller. But that didn't happen. Instead, 6 seconds after the plane has crossed over Igari, it vanishes from radar screens. It's not there. And when I say vanish from radar screens, let me explain real quickly what I mean by that. There are different ways that a plane electronically keeps in touch with the world around it. It's very important that planes not collide with one another. So especially over busy airports, you really don't want people just flying any which way. They're kept under tight control by air traffic control, which tells them where to go and when and what angle to fly at and so forth. And in this case, the air traffic controller has been watching MH370 on the radar screens. And you might be familiar with something called primary radar. Back in World War II, they invented this idea that if you shine radio waves out into space, out into the atmosphere, and it encounters a metal airplane, it will reflect it like a mirror. And if you have a big enough antenna, you can catch that signal coming back, and you will know more or less how far away it is and what direction it is. That is not what air traffic controllers primarily use, though. They use something called secondary radar. And what happens is the radar sends out a signal. When the plane detects that signal, it sends its own signal. So it's an active transmission of electronic energy, essentially. And this response contains data in it. It tells air traffic controllers the altitude that the plane is at, and it tells them who it is. This is something that the plane has to actively transmit. So one of the things that happens when the plane passes Igari is that system is turned off. So when the radar tower in Malaysia sends that broadcast out, nothing comes back. Well, the signal that's just passively reflected off the skin of the aircraft, that will get received. But air traffic controllers don't really pay attention to that. They pay attention to a symbol that is on their radar screen that is generated by the computer system that runs the system that they're looking at. And that symbol that says MH370 has now vanished. It's not on the screen anymore. Now, normally, if they were actively paying attention to the aircraft and under their control, they would certainly notice that. That is a big deal for this plane to suddenly not be there anymore. But remember, they've said goodnight. They've said goodbye. It's not their problem anymore. Conversely, Ho Chi Minh, which is waiting for them to show up, they haven't been on their radar screens. They haven't been there. And Ho Chi Minh doesn't really know where they are. They've been told by Kuala Lumpur that they're inbound, but they haven't shown up yet. And the aircraft hasn't called them yet either. So as far as they know, they have no idea where this plane is. Maybe it hasn't left yet. Maybe they had problems getting the food truck up to the plane. There's a million reasons why planes can be delayed. So Kuala Lumpur has put it out of their minds. Ho Chi Minh is just cooling their heels, waiting for something to happen. Nobody is paying attention to this plane. So it's not on their screens anymore. It's not broadcasting any other kind of information either. It's not broadcasting over the radio, which is just like, I think that's pretty intuitive what a radio is. It's like, you click on your mic and you say, hey, anybody out there want to talk to me? We just saw the pilot say, good night, Malaysia 370. So that's a radio transmission. But after he stops doing that, you don't have to turn off the radio. You just don't transmit and nothing will come out of the plane. Another way that a plane generates electronic signals is called ACARS. And this originally started out as a kind of text message system that was used by airlines to schedule their flights and pilots' duty time and so forth. And they later added other kinds of information that you can send. If your wife or husband wants to send you a message, they can do that over ACARS. If there's a mechanical problem, the system might automatically generate a sort of a health checkup to transmit to the operations center at the airline's headquarters. So there's various kinds of bits and bobs of data that can go over this automated system that will happen whether or not the pilot knows about it or not. The pilot can also do things actively. But that system was turned off. We know because several minutes before it had sent its last automatic transmission and no transmissions were received after that. So there's another system called ADSB, and this is something that had only started to be rolled out fairly recently. It's a much newer technology than the other ones that we've mentioned. This is a system that is designed to increase safety by basically transmitting freely and voluntarily the information about where you are in the sky so that the other planes can avoid you. And this is also used by flight tracking software. If you use something like Flight Radar, that uses basically the plane sends out these radio signals. They're picked up by ground stations all around the world. You can have one yourself if you want. People can just kind of voluntarily take part in this network. And it doesn't work over the open ocean. And so once you leave the proximity to land, it eventually fades out. But when the plane was at Agari, it was still close enough to land that it was sending detectable ADSB signals. However, 6 seconds after Agari, that system gets turned off too. So ACARS is not transmitting, ADSB is not transmitting, and the transponder that connects with secondary radar is also not transmitting. So this plane is not there. Now, no one was paying attention, so nobody noticed that all these systems went dark. But later, when investigators tried to figure out, wait, what happened to this plane? All this data was not there. So they were really left with a scarcity of evidence as to what happened. But the crucial thing to understand here is that nobody on the ground knew that something had started to go wrong. Only much later, when people looked at the data that had been recorded automatically, did they see, oh, this thing had started to happen 6 seconds after Agari, but that was only discovered much later. So what I've described is in some ways a little bit reminiscent of another incident that had happened just a few years before. I'm talking about Air France 447. This was a flight that took off from Rio de Janeiro on June 30th of 2009, and it flew over the Atlantic Ocean, and it was due to arrive in Paris the next day, and it didn't. And something very similar happened with MH370, where it took off in the middle of the night, was supposed to arrive in a different city, and it didn't. And as time went by, in the case of both of these planes, people gradually started to get more and more anxious about where is this plane. In the case of Air France 447, it too had left one area of air traffic control and there was a gap before it could talk to the next. In that case, because it was over the middle of a large ocean, there was several hours that were going to elapse before the next air traffic controller expected to hear from them. So there was a much longer period of time in which something had gone wrong, but nobody on the ground knew that something had gone wrong because there was no way for them to know it. Later, signals from the ACARS system that had been recorded automatically were taken out of storage, looked at, and then people started to figure out that something had gone wrong. But there were no alarms that went off. There was no signal that woke somebody up and said, hey, look at something's gone wrong. But this is a parallel. It's not like this had never happened before, where a plane in between air traffic control zones had just vanished. In the case of Air France 447, something had gone wrong. It's a very elaborate story, but it had to do with both some system failures and some human errors, which combined to have the plane hit the ocean, and everyone aboard died very soon after problems started to arise. So when people on the ground on March 8th started to wonder why they hadn't heard from MH370, they obviously were going to get very worried. Increasingly worried as the minutes ticked by. By the time the plane was supposed to land in Beijing, it hadn't been seen anywhere. Calls were going back and forth between the various air traffic control authorities. Everyone was wondering, maybe they had an emergency and had to land somewhere else. Maybe they landed in Cambodia. Maybe they had to divert somewhere else. What could have happened? But the longer a plane goes without being in contact, the more worried people are going to get. And the more and more it seems like this is a very bad situation. And of course, people are going to think about recent incidents that were similar. They're going to think about Air France 447. And it's kind of a historical fact that when planes disappear, it's usually an accident. And the accident, in the case of a commercial airliner like this, it's fatal. And so as dawn breaks on the morning of March 8th, moods are very grim, and the authorities start to send out search planes and to try to see if they can find any trace of this plane, maybe wreckage, maybe there are some rafts with people on them. Conceivably, it could have landed. I mean, there was a 737 flight a few years ago where they had power failure in their engines during a storm, and they wound up landing on a levee, a earthen embankment. So it is possible for planes that have mechanical problems, even severe mechanical problems, to land and for everyone to survive. We remember the Sully Miracle on the Hudson case. Everyone survived. It wasn't that it was hopeless, but the presumption, as these hours are starting to tick by, the presumption is that something very bad had happened. The plane has probably crashed near its final transmission. The reason why the transmission stopped was that the plane crashed. That is your sort of default scenario in a situation like this. I remember when it happened, I'd been writing about air crashes for a decade already. I had had my pilot's license for a while. I was a freelance journalist. I remember thinking at the time when the news first broke that this plane hadn't arrived at its destination, that it didn't seem particularly unusual. But right off the bat, there was that strange detail. There was an uncanny piece of timing. And this detail would come to seem more and more important as the days went on, and we learned more jaw-dropping details about what had happened on that flight. So we're going to leave the tale here for now. It's the end of day one. The authorities are trying to figure out what happened to this plane that had disappeared off radar screens. They have sent out search and rescue planes. Nothing has been seen, but that is not so surprising. When planes go missing, it takes a little while to find the debris. can take a couple days. But based on past experience, like Air France 447, people thought the plane had come to some kind of grief near Agari, and most likely to crash in the ocean. They're looking for pieces of debris floating on the surface. If they can spot that, it's going to be pretty easy to find the rest of the wreckage. At this point, the case seems not that unusual, potentially very tragic, but not that unusual, and fairly easy to solve. Of course, none of that happened. I'll leave you with that cliffhanger for now. Join me next week for episode 3 of Deep Dive MH370 as the case continues its descent into the strange / borderline impossible. As rumors spread, it turns out that MH370 didn't crash into the South China Sea after all. So I'll leave you with that. If you like the show, please subscribe. And I am very grateful for your spending the time with me today. I'll leave you with my words of wisdom, which are don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. So long for now. Bye-bye.